Hello and welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei in Hangzhou. Coming up on today's G20 special, China opens the 2016 G20 summit this weekend. Boosting a sluggish world economy is a major focus this year. 800 business leaders are already gathering to provide ideas on driving growth. How will they contribute to the G20 agenda? We talk with global banking leaders, finance and commerce ministers, and economic experts about what this year's event can achieve. China is counting down to the 2016 G20 summit. Member leaders are arriving in the city of Hangzhou. Reviving the world economy remains one of the focus points this year. Global business leaders are also gathering in Hangzhou ahead of the G20 summit to provide ideas on how to drive growth. Here's a look at what to expect.
Getting ready for the big day, the last G20 coordinators meeting has finished preparations for this Sunday's summit. Bulletins for the meeting have been finalized. China's Vice Foreign Minister Li Baodong says the two-day meeting is expected to witness more than 30 outcomes, an unprecedented number. The summit comes at a time when the world economy continues to struggle through a fragile recovery. Ahead of the G20 summit, business leaders from the member countries are also gathering. The so-called B20 aligns with the G20. It has already submitted its latest policy recommendations to the group. These include ideas on how to drive global growth while developing more effective economic and financial governance. The organizer of the meeting says policymakers have to clear roadblocks for global trade in order to boost growth.
We recommend the government set up transparent guidelines for trade policies, allow agencies to access the process, and help with dispute settlement.
During the B20 meeting, business leaders will discuss 6 task forces: financing growth, trade and investment, infrastructure, small and medium enterprises development, employment, and anti-corruption. Chinese President Xi Jinping will also address the meeting.
For more on expectations from the coming G20 and B20, we have invited Leslie Mestorp, who is the Vice President and also CFO of BRICS New Development Bank. Leslie, welcome to our program. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me again.
Beautiful Hangzhou, isn't it?
Very pretty city.
But can we expect some beautiful results coming out of the G20 summit and also the B20 meetings? What about from the BRICS perspective?
I think firstly, the China leadership of the G20 gave prominence to a couple of themes. I want to focus on 2. The first one is infrastructure. At the moment, there's a search for new growth levers. Where could the potential growth impetus come from? As you know, there's a sluggish world economy, China slowing down, commodity prices have tapered off, etc. There's monetary easing happening in large parts of the world. So infrastructure and the provision of infrastructure is seen as one of those potential spurts for new growth. So from a BRICS perspective and from a new development bank perspective, that is specifically where we as an institution play a role in a modest way to provide the necessary capital to as a contributor to the engines of growth.
But having said that, I mean, look at the BRICS economies. They seem to be at very different stages when it comes to development growth. All have their own versions of challenges. Will they be able to come to consensus? Well, the state leaders from those BRIC countries gathering just in 24 hours, I guess.
As you know, each of the BRICS countries have their own distinctive economic, political, and other challenges. The economies are united with a common set of vision and aspiration, if you like. And the New Development Bank is hoping that through infrastructure provision, we can provide that extra spurt in growth. But it is almost virtually impossible to provide a roadmap that is common amongst these very diverse economies.
Infrastructure, particularly when it comes to development stage, they need absolutely very different kinds of infrastructure.
Absolutely, but the countries are united in the vision to create or to future-proof infrastructure and to green infrastructure processes. As you know, China's undergoing a very fundamental transition from, sort of an industrial structure, brown economy, towards a green economy. And many of the BRICS economies, South Africa, India, Brazil, all of these economies are undergoing a similar transition.
Right.
Part of the G20, China has given leadership to this idea of finding green finance, or looking at the possibility of having green finance provide a further impetus, if you like, to that transition.
Always positive messages coming from you, Leslie, but I have to ask you, New Development Bank, of course, is the development bank put together by the BRICS countries. Each have an equal share and each have an equal say.
Yeah.
And yet, you also have AIIB, whose membership has much exceeded just China and some of the other developing and emerging economies. So what do you make of these two concepts and two organizations? How are you going to interact with one another, or your competition?
We are fraternal or sisterly or brotherly organizations, if you like. We have very strong overlap in our mandate. We both focus on infrastructure and on sustainable development. Obviously, the AIIB has got a much broader global remit already, 57 member states, and I understand something like 36 on a waiting list, whereas the New Development Bank only has 5 members. However, there is no competition in the space. As you know, there's such a large infrastructure financing gap, the amount of resources required versus what is available. So we really work in complementary fashions. But overall, the New Development Bank is focused on becoming the multilateral bank for emerging markets.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. But talking about the New Development Bank and the BRICS economies behind it, the BRICS economies, they're all emerging ones. And there are developing countries that are joining this year's G20 summit. There are also observing countries coming from the developing world. And of course, you also got many developed economies. Are we going to see more fights, more heated debate among these very different camps? International, negotiation, you usually see these different camps having very different opinions. Leslie?
As you know, over the last couple of decades, really, there's been simmering tensions, because the developed world has obviously been dominating and playing a leadership role in global governance. That has changed with the advent of the G20. I would say the G20 specifically over the last 8 years has given greater voice to emerging markets.
Right.
The fact that China is having the presidency this year has further entrenched that notion that emerging markets have a key role to play in these broader issues. As you know, the G7 economies have contributed more than 50% to global GDP, let's say 20 years ago. That has reduced to around 31% now. But yet the control of global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank still rest with those economies. So there are underlying tensions. But the important point to focus on, Tian, is the fact that the common vision, the common aspirations dominate these conversations.
Right.
The tensions are there, but the differentiated and shared responsibility.
Your gestures seem to tell me about that word.
There's an undeniable momentum towards bringing these countries together to focus on our common challenges, because most of the big challenges facing the world, climate change, etc., they are not national in character, they are global, and it requires global responses.
Yes, indeed. We're looking forward to what you have just explained to us. Leslie Mastor, Vice President and CFO of BRICS New Development Bank. Really appreciate it with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All the best for the upcoming days of conferences. Thank you. And we'll be back after this. The upcoming B20 meeting is a key platform for global business leaders to try and influence the policy making of major powers such as China and the United States. We talked to Mr. Zhu Guangyao, the Chinese Vice Minister of Finance. He shares his views on the global economy and China's role in stabilizing the global finance market. Before the exclusive interview, let's take a look at the concerns of this year's B20 meeting.
The B20 meetings were established in 2010 under the G20 framework to provide the business community with a platform to influence global trade issues and economic governance. This year, they will discuss the B20's 6 task forces, namely financing growth, trade and investment, infrastructure, SME development, employment, and anti-corruption. And the B20 has already submitted its latest policy recommendations to the G20. The Chinese Vice Minister of Finance, Zhu Guangyao, held a press conference earlier today. He introduced the consensus reached among G20 central bank governors and finance ministers to boost economic growth. And he said this would be submitted to G20 leaders for review. In the face of growing global economic uncertainties, the world has high expectations for the G20 Hangzhou Summit. Hopes are the summit will realize its target of building an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy.
And I'm joined here by Vice Minister Zhu Guangyao from the Ministry of Finance. He's also the Finance Deputy of G20. Vice Minister Zhu, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you.
Communique of the G20 is really the focus for everyone. So, can we know more details about the preparation at this moment?
Yes, indeed. That's the communique of G20 leaders is the most important document, and which will demonstrate the achievement of the Hangzhou G20 summit. China, under the leadership by President Xi Jinping, we made this big effort to consult all G20 members, was that sought members' highs, and also we gave this strong proposal. It's that innovation, vigorous interconnection, as well as inclusive development. So those proposals as the main theme, strongly supported by all G20 members. We really hope that G20 communique of Hangzhou Summit will get great achievement under these 4 pillars. For example, innovation. We are very happy to see the real development to formulate inclusive digital finance guidance. If that's approved by leaders meeting, that's the first document of policy guidance related digital development.
Let's take a look at the G20. I mean, yes, 80% of the world economy, but on the other hand, all these economies coming from 5 continents. Very complicated when it comes to development stages. They all have their own development priorities, and they have their different agendas when coming to the G20. So the question is, will this G20 be able to focus on the real and some of the most important issues?
So if I talk about the important issue and also talk about the mission of G20, is that always focus on global growth and the international finance market stability. And you see there's a very diversified interest among G20 members. However, I must reiterate, this forum, this platform really demonstrate the global development result, reflect this global reality that's much better than this so-called G7 or G7 plus X something that's already become the history. G7 can continue, but they understand their influence be limited. That's in the developed countries. So particularly without China join, that's impossible to solve the global problem, particularly global economic problem.
It is, but at the same time, we see China and United States still being the 2 biggest economies of the world. And both, of course, are members of the G20. So many wonder, Vice Minister Zhu, whether the 2 countries really likely to cooperate this time, or one is likely to derail the other's efforts. I do have a quote coming from the White House before President Obama's coming to Asia. Here it is. It is likely to underscore the importance of G20 cooperation in promoting a level playing field and broad-based economic opportunity, end of quote.
In the history of G20 summit, China and the US keep this very good policy coordination. And for promote growth policy and keep finance market stability, certainly we have this same goal. And we must comprehensively use monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural policy together. Absolutely, we have same position, and we are all agree to against the currency competition, use the currency to take advantage of trade. And we also together support. We must have very close consultation on foreign exchange market. So you can see we have very broad common points. And of course, that U.S. is the number one economy. China is the second largest economy. In the countryside, we need less more policy coordination too. But in G20 process, in general, we have good coordination.
Well, you think about it, Vice Minister Zhu, there have been a lot of questions raised by whether international media or the international community. What exactly is China having in mind, making so much effort for this year's G20 summit?
That's China certainly understand. We are a member of global society, and we must very close coordinate cooperation with other major economies to make extreme efforts to promote global growth. That's the challenge we together faced. Also, that's international finance stability. China already is a big player in that. We must really have policy coordination, cooperation with others. So that's certainly successful G20 Hangzhou meeting is in line with China's big interest. Also, that's a big contribution to the global peace and development, and particularly to promote the global economy with a strong, balanced, sustainable way to develop.
But what about China itself? I mean, the reason why China has the credibility is because China's own opening up and reform success, China's own efforts in making its economy to grow at a high digital rate that many others have aspirations to. So what about now? Does China has the credibility to make it happen this time, even as someone hosting the G20?
And you know, that's the Chinese economy already very close interconnected with the global economy. China is a key member of global economic system. Also, that's the Chinese policy already have very important spillover to the global economic system. We really hope our spillover continue to play very positive way.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister Zhu from the Ministry of Finance, who's also the Finance Deputy of G20. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Vice Minister from the Ministry of Finance, Zhu Guangyao, with us. Apart from addressing financial challenges, trade ministers from the G20 economy has also been working very hard before the G20 summit on boosting global business. Earlier, I talked to Mr. Wang Shouwen, Vice Minister of Chinese Ministry of Commerce. He said ministers from the G20 members agree to further remove trade barriers. He also mentioned China's target of continuing to reduce overcapacity. Vice Minister Wang, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you, Tianwei, for inviting me here.
What can we expect, Vice Minister Wang, from this year's B20 and also the G20 summit when it comes to trade, experiencing 5 consecutive years of very low growth now?
Indeed, you are right that trade growth has been very sluggish over the past 5 years. That's exactly the realization of the G20 members. Therefore, we have attached enormous importance to this issue. What can G20 do? What can G20 do to stimulate the global trade growth? As a result of the trade ministers meeting in Shanghai and 4 trade and investment working group meetings before that, we were very happy that we have arrived at a proposal called G20 strategy. For example, we need to do something to reduce the trade cost. Trade cost has incumbent a lot of small businesses from joining the global value chains. We need to improve the trade finance situation. Businesses in developing economies have difficulty in accessing to bank loans, even though they have good orders, but they are not able to fulfill the order because of lack of access to financing. And e-commerce is growing very fast, but there are some hurdles hindering the e-commerce development. So we need to address that issue as well. Trading services is growing very fast. this is in sharp contrast to trading goods. But again, there need to be liberalization of market access for trading services, and there are some regulatory barriers to trading services. So we need to do improvement in that area as well.
Vice Minister Wang, when I listen to you, already in my head, long list of to-do list, and yet will these to-do be realized this time during the B20, during the G20 summit, when the political leaders are here? They should provide the political support, will they, though?
Indeed, I think there's a high expectation from the business community that these exact measures will be implemented. That's why the trade ministers meeting has reached an agreement which will be presented to the Hangzhou summit for endorsement, and hopefully the leaders will endorse those proposals. And if they endorse these proposals, they will get implemented in their individual countries, and that will provide long-term impetus for trade growth.
I think actions are urgently needed. When earlier we talked about the realities of international trade, but now, Vice Minister Wang, there has been a lot of debate going on. Exactly what mechanisms should we use when it comes to trade? Is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, still relevant? Remember, I mean, more than 10 years ago, China was working so hard to join. China benefited from it, but now, is it still relevant?
WTO is very relevant today as it was in the past years. I think we need to look at the WTO in a more objective manner. For example, even though Doha round has been dragging on for 15 years so far, it does deliver, and it has delivered some important agreements, like the TFA agreement, Trade Facilitation Agreement, like the Nairobi package. The Nairobi agreement, which was reached last year, is a very important victory for developing economies, for the exporters of agricultural products. It will eliminate the export subsidy to exports of agricultural products. So this is our milestone agreements.
Among the G20 economies, as we mentioned, at different development stages, and they're all facing the issue of overcapacity. And some have been accusing China of being a major player of providing the world's overcapacity. For example, in some negotiation between China and the United States. What do you make of these kinds of accusations, Vice Minister Wang?
This issue is a global issue. This issue is not emanating from a single country. This is an issue which has been there for some time in many economies. And ministers also agree that we need to have collective global action to address the overcapacity issue. As far as China is concerned, I think China has been very responsible in this regard. While some other economies were talking about reducing overcapacity, China has adopted concrete measures to reduce the overcapacity of some sectors like steel. Over the past 5 years, we cut the steel overcapacity by 90 million tons, and we have made the plan to cut further the capacity of steel in China by another 100 million tons to 150 million tons. So China has been very serious in tackling this issue, but this issue again is a global issue. It requires the collective efforts of G20 members and beyond.
I remember when you came into the studio, you told me you got a lot of things to do later today. So I guess it's time to let you go, roll up the sleeves, and do something good for the rest of the world. Thank you so much, Vice Minister Wang, for being with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tianwei.
You're watching World Insight coming to you from Hangzhou. Innovation is one of those key words with the theme of this year's 2016 G20 summit. It is an important driver behind the Chinese economy, many believe, as China continues to transform its economic development mode and structures. The government is expected to create an innovative mechanism. We earlier held a discussion about innovation in our Beijing studio with some experts. Before we go to that, let's take a look at how the Chinese companies work to innovate so far.
Innovation leading the way. Alibaba Group, China's largest e-commerce company, is not only famously good at online retailing, but has also outperformed in e-finance. This can be seen from its widely used e-wallet to its newly launched online-only bank, MyBank.
Alibaba and Ant Financial have collected a huge database of customers' transactions. We will analyze the data and evaluate the credibility of customers.
Innovation is not only valued by tech companies. The traditional manufacturing industry also works at it. For example, clothing companies, under the pressure from increasing labor costs and competition, pay a lot to come up with innovative designs.
Customers are more demanding now. If they don't like the design of our clothes, they won't buy them, even if the price is low.
China has now broken into the world's top 25 innovative economies for the first time. Over 500 national incubators have been opened across the country to encourage innovative startups. Hopes are high that the promotion of innovation could activate a new engine for China's economy.
For more on how innovation can drive economic growth, we are joined by Duncan Clark of BDA China. He recently wrote a book about Alibaba. Welcome to our program. Meanwhile, we're also joined by Jay Huang, former managing director of Intel China, and now as an investor in the market. Meanwhile, from New York, we're having Professor Max Wolf, professor of economics from New School University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you. Duncan, you've been talking about Alibaba for years with that book. But the thing is, how Alibaba becomes so successful? How much does innovation play its role?
Well, there are two types of innovation at the core. There's the sort of invention innovation, the really radical stuff. And most people think about innovation as that. But a lot of innovation is actually incremental, tinkering with things, market innovation. And Alibaba has really excelled at that, as well as Tencent, we can say. It's not always the eureka moment innovation that really pays off. And Jack Ma and his peers at Alibaba have shown that putting things together to suit the Chinese market, lending from the West, but also improving on it, is the way to go.
Is that China's contribution, Mr. Huang?
I think Chinese internet companies, they started with maybe like a business model innovation, i.e. learning from international companies, and then adapt to the market and also the market needs. And then they put lots of small steps and evolutionary innovation from there, accumulated into quite a big innovation in the end.
If we look at not just Alibaba, but also WeChat, for example, Professor Wolf, it is becoming so many things combined into one. It's reading, it's media, it is also banking in a way, and it has also the different kinds of functions of chats and many others. Where is it going? How much of this kind of evolving innovation likely to provide with the market?
Yeah, so I think the world is on the cusp of copying WeChat. Snapchat, which is probably the closest competitor here in the US, as well as WhatsApp, which is a Facebook property. Snapchat's an independent company. They're really trying to do a version of WeChat for the non-Chinese market, principally the US market, and principally younger US consumers. However, we expect these sort of chat messaging apps like WeChat or Snapchat to become the new mobile operating system. And instead of all these apps, because there are too many and the discovery process for apps is pretty fundamentally broken, we're going to see AI, or artificial intelligence, little bots sitting on top of these messenger apps doing things like banking, booking tickets, getting news, finding weather. So we actually think it's the next generation mobile operating system, and we think WeChat is set to dominate the Chinese market.
Having said that, Duncan, what is the next step? You see BTA, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, particularly the latter two, seem to be the leader of the market at least. But what's next?
Well, I think increasingly we can talk about A and T, Alibaba and Tencent. Those two companies are about roughly the same. Together they're worth $500 billion. And Baidu has been lagging behind. There's a big question over what is going to be Baidu's next act. But for Alibaba and Tencent, they're really moving into areas, particularly finance, that have traditionally been the preserve of the state. So this raises the interesting question, inefficiency in China is really the oxygen for the internet, in fact everywhere. But in China, through traditional state involvement, there are areas that are not so open. In the US, for example, banking is more efficient, retail is more efficient. So in China, in a sense, the internet is more powerful even to change people's lives than in the US.
Now, this comes to an interesting question, which is what's likely to be the relations between tech giants like this in China, usually private ones, such as Alibaba, such as Tencent, vis-a-vis its relations with the government and the state-owned enterprises. Professor Wolf, observing from afar, what do you make of that evolution?
Yeah, so I think we might add another third, which is the Ant Financial Group, which we expect to have an IPO in the not too distant future. And I think they really do illustrate this tension between traditional private industry, state-owned industry, and new innovators. But I think we know that we're on the cusp of three major shifts. One, we have the deep belief that artificial intelligence is coming. Two, we have the deep belief that virtual and augmented reality are the next generation of both workplace and consumer tech tool. And three, we have this idea that banking, insurance, and finance are about to be completely remade by the internet. And it looks like Tencent, Alibaba, and Ant Financial, and possibly some other companies, but principally those, are going to be global leaders and China dominant. And remember too, we're sitting through an era in which the Chinese middle class is going to become the global leading middle class, and therefore global products, both hardware, software, etc., will be made to Chinese tastes. So what works in China will be working for a significant portion of the world probably in the near future.
All right. This is interesting because we are talking about the next stage already. That's exactly what we're focusing on, isn't it? Running up to the B20 and also the G20. How the governance should be done. What is the government's relations with the businesses? And Mr. Huang, here comes the interesting part. What about the government's relations with these new high-tech companies that's likely to transcend borders? It is not just what the legislative process or contents might be here in Asia or in China. But more than that, what about the global trading system? Are they updated towards the needs of these companies? Or should they be adjusted toward the needs of these companies? Because we don't want to forget there are other companies as well, traditional industries, and also some of those industries we have already got so familiar with. Mr. Huang.
I think there's new challenges for all the government. So far, all the enterprises have a border, and they have their own nationality, and then you can say this is a U.S. company, of course, and then the other one is maybe a different company. We see globalization, lots of companies become like a multinational corporation.
Particularly with high-tech companies.
Yeah, yes. However, I think for example, what Alibaba want to do is really go beyond the border. I think this will create new challenges for all the governments and around the global. I think one thing is if we can see those giants go across the border, they bring up the efficiency and all the benefit to the consumers. On the other hand, how can each government really help them and also regulate them if necessary, and instead of put all the barrier for them to go across the border?
Mr. Clark, do governments understand what's going on?
Some do, but it's quite scary because governments depend on raising tax revenue and customs revenue and all the things that actually the internet is challenging at. Actually, how do you tax these things? Do you tax innovation if this is really a contribution? But increasingly, globalization is taking on new forms. It's not just the big multinational companies. Increasingly, it's small and medium-sized enterprises. Right. And Jack Ma is talking about an EWTP to replace the WTO, to sort of have an electronic
EWETP, you probably need to explain to our viewers.
I'm not entirely.
You are not dealing with Jack Ma every day instead of you. But explain to us.
Well, the idea is that the WTO framework, which is a government-to-government framework, may not serve the future needs of business. And increasingly, small and medium-sized enterprises, which has really been the sort of core focus for Alibaba, are interacting with each other. And increasingly, consumers are buying from around the world without, relying on multinationals.
So what Mr. Ma is trying to propose from the very beginning of this year is more about tax-free, custom-free procedures so that S&M can do their businesses across border just like that, with a snap of fingers. Will that become a reality? Can they still work? I mean, within the current system we are still having. But on the other hand, is that an ideal system for all the others as well? Because we're not just talking about S&M trading on Alibaba, we're talking about everybody.
I think a vision is right. I think that's benefit and the people around the globe. But I can now see the government can easily adapt to that vision because we hear government officials are talking about cyber and and sovereignty, for example. If the information cannot flow across the border, now we're talking about the real goods flow across the borders. I think that should be more challenge and then the information flow.
Well, that is only one aspect of those challenges that's facing us today. Professor Wolf, what do you make of it?
Yes, so it looks to me that the internet opens up this opportunity for much more fluid borders, for corporations and individuals to express themselves across traditional territorial lines. On the other hand, we have a world where hostility to trade, particularly in the developed West, is growing radically, and populist politicians making sometimes outlandish but aggressive claims about restricting, cutting off, or rolling back trade deals. And even if we see what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership here and how it became an issue in the US presidential elections or the Brexit vote in England, it looks that public will is not caught up to market potential. And when the public's will and market potential are at cross purposes, you have a period of tumultuousness, and it's hard to know exactly where you're headed. We need to go toward more openness, but it's not clear that the public in many countries are completely convinced that this is benefiting them.
Okay, gentlemen, because we are on the eve of the B20. After all, that is a platform for business leaders from around the world to solve the problem as we see them. So what can be our expectations for them? What should they achieve in order to make sure that really we are going to have some brighter future? Mr. Clark.
Well, the fact that the B20 and the G20 are being held in Hangzhou specifically is an interesting sign. It's the first time China's hosted the event. And Hangzhou is not the Silicon Valley of China, but is one of the 2 or 3 contenders to that crown. And increasingly, I think that's a sign that technology is going to be part of solving these problems, not just in areas we talked about finance, but also in healthcare and using the power of big data. And increasingly, these companies, like the Alibabas and Tencents and their US equivalents, are bigger, perhaps more powerful than governments in terms of the resources at their hand. And you're right, how do we regulate them? Or do they self-regulate through competition? But the ultimate goal, we have to get on the same page as to what are the key achievements that need to be taken to avoid this backlash, both to globalization and to technology, which is...
Professor Wolf, any specific expectations out of these B20 business leaders?
Yeah, so I think that we're going to see the B20 and a little bit less, but to some extent the G20, try to reiterate the importance of cooperation and working together on global challenges, which we must do. The question is whether they can go home to their respective governments, their respective publics, and get the same level of excitement about a cooperative future that I expect we'll see in the B20, G20 meetings. The question is, can they carry those meetings' sentiment and momentum home and make forward progress? I deeply hope so, but I have to be honest with you, I am a bit skeptical just at the mood in many of these countries. It will be hard to translate that momentum to policy and attitude at home, I think.
Well, the 3 of you have been very inspiring in terms of your generosity of providing a future. Before we go, Mr. Huang, also your expectation.
I like to see the business leader continuing to do the technology innovation. I like to see the government side of it, and they truly provide the leadership instead of follow what's the voters and the fear, and then so they can reduce the barrier and then get a truly technology innovation across the borders.
All right. Tomorrow, we're going to see those business leaders coming from G20 economies come together. They better come up with some answers, gentlemen, to the wonderful questions all of you have raised. Thank you so much, Duncan Clark, Jay Huang, Max Wolf. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
That's all for today. We will continue our special G20 coverage on Sunday to mark the opening of the summit. Be sure to tune in then at our special time. If you'd like to see more program, you can also visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team in Beijing and Hangzhou, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.